Picture a scientist holding a single dried lump no bigger than a coin, and that tiny piece of ancient human waste is about to rewrite everything you were ever taught about who came to America first. It doesn't look like much. It looks like a pebble or a clump of dirt or nothing at all. But locked inside it is a genetic fingerprint that would eventually shatter one of the most stubborn beliefs in modern science. And it happened in a place nobody expected, a scatter of quiet rock shelters in the high desert of southern Oregon. For most of the last 100 years, American schoolchildren were taught a simple story. At the end of the Ice Age, roughly 13,000 years ago, a small band of hunters crossed a frozen land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, pushed south through a gap that opened between two melting ice sheets, and became the first human beings to ever set foot on this continent. They carried a distinctive, beautifully carved stone spear point, first identified near the town of Clovis, New Mexico, and so they became known as the Clovis people. For decades, this was not just a theory. It was treated as settled fact. It was drawn on chalkboards. It was printed in textbooks. It became known, simply, as Clovis first. But a quiet cluster of caves in Oregon was about to prove that story wrong, and it would do it with the least glamorous kind of evidence imaginable. The site is called Paisley Caves, a set of shallow, unremarkable rock shelters tucked into a ridge above an ancient dry lake bed in the high desert of south-central Oregon. They are not deep, dramatic caverns. They are the kind of place a small group of travelers might duck into for a single night, out of the wind, to build a small fire and rest before moving on. For thousands of years, wind-blown dust drifted into those shelters and slowly settled, layer upon layer, sealing whatever lay on the floor beneath a blanket of sediment that would eventually grow many feet thick. Nobody paid the caves much attention at first. They looked ordinary. That was exactly what made the discovery inside them so hard to dismiss. When archaeologists began carefully excavating the floor of those shelters, they were not searching for gold or lost cities. They were doing the slow, patient work of real archaeology, recording the position of every layer, every fleck of ash, every fragment of bone. And deep in those layers, they found something strange. Small, dried, unremarkable-looking lumps of ancient organic material. Coprolites. The scientific term for fossilized human and animal waste. To an untrained eye, they looked like nothing more than clumps of dirt. But when researchers extracted and analyzed the genetic material preserved inside them, the results were extraordinary. They contained human DNA, sealed and protected for thousands of years by the cold, dry, stable conditions of the shelter floor. To understand why this mattered so much, you need to understand the single question that has haunted every claim of ancient humans in North America for more than half a century. Did a person actually make this, or did nature simply make it look that way? Stone can be an incredible forger. A rockfall can chip the edge of a stone until it resembles a crude blade. A tumbling river can round and flake a rock until it looks almost like a tool shaped by human hands. Archaeologists even have a name for these natural imposters: geofacts, objects that look like artifacts but were never touched by a person at all. For 50 years, the moment someone claimed to have found a tool older than Clovis, that single word, geofact, was often enough to end the conversation. But you cannot accidentally create a piece of human biology. No landslide, no flood, no frost cycle on Earth produces the genetic signature of a human digestive system. When those ancient coprolites tested positive for human DNA, the geofact argument simply had nothing left to say. This was not a stone that resembled a tool. This was direct, undeniable biological evidence that a living person had once crouched in that shelter, breathing, resting, and had left behind a trace of their own body that would outlast their entire civilization. Even so, the scientific community did not accept it quietly, and in fairness, they shouldn't have. Extraordinary claims deserve extraordinary scrutiny, and this claim was about to challenge a paradigm that had stood for most of a century. Critics raised a serious and completely reasonable objection. Even if the coprolites were ancient, and even if the layer around them was old, how could anyone be certain the two matched up? Water moves slowly through desert sediment over thousands of years, and it is entirely possible for it to carry small particles downward, dragging younger material deep into older soil, creating the illusion of an ancient artifact in a spot it never truly belonged. So the researchers went back to work. They didn't argue. They tested. They used a highly precise dating method called accelerator mass spectrometry, which counts the individual carbon atoms inside the specific object being examined, rather than estimating the age of the surrounding dirt. This method dates the object itself, not its neighbors, which makes it far harder to fool. They also studied the specific chemical markers that distinguish human waste from that of the coyotes, foxes, and other animals that also use the shelters over the centuries, ruling out the possibility that they were looking at the leavings of a predator that had simply eaten and processed something human. And they mapped the surrounding sediment layer by layer, searching for any sign of the water disturbance that the skeptics had warned about. The results held. Layer after layer, sample after sample, the dating consistently placed early human activity at the site at roughly 14,300 years ago, which is more than 1,000 years earlier than the oldest confirmed Clovis artifacts ever found anywhere in North America. The people who left those coprolites behind in the Oregon desert had been living, breathing, and resting in that shelter before the culture that textbooks called the first Americans had ever chipped a single one of their famous spear points. Sit with that for a moment, because it matters. This was not a wild guess or a fringe theory scribbled on the back of a napkin. This was a direct, repeatedly tested, independently verified conclusion, built from a form of evidence that could not be argued away as a trick of geology. A person had been in Oregon before Clovis. And once that fact survived every challenge thrown at it, the door that had been sealed shut for decades finally began to open. Here is the part of the story that rarely gets told, because it is the part that makes this discovery so much bigger than one cave in one desert. A single extraordinary site, no matter how solid, can always be quarantined by a cautious scientific community. It can be called a fluke, an outlier, a strange local anomaly that will surely be explained away eventually. One unusual result is easy to isolate. But while researchers were still debating the Oregon findings, other teams working in entirely different parts of the country, using entirely different methods, on entirely different kinds of evidence, began pulling their own impossible discoveries out of the ground. In southwestern Pennsylvania, deep beneath a great sandstone overhang, archaeologists spent years painstakingly excavating a rock shelter, recording every layer with such precision that the resulting record reads almost like the growth rings inside a tree trunk. Near the very bottom of that sequence, while below the layers containing familiar, expected tools, they uncovered hearths, deliberately built fires, along with stone blades clearly shaped by human hands. When the charcoal from those deep fires was dated, the results lined up in a long, unbroken, perfectly ordered sequence, oldest material at the bottom, youngest material near the top, exactly as an undisturbed site should look. The deepest human traces in that Pennsylvania shelter also landed thousands of years before Clovis. Different state, different research team, different dating material entirely, and yet the same impossible conclusion. Then came a discovery in the American Southwest that would push the boundaries even further. At the edge of what was once a shallow ancient lake, now a dry, windswept basin of hardened white gypsum, researchers found something almost impossible to argue with: footprints. Dozens of them, then hundreds. The tracks of adults, and unmistakably, the small footprints of children, running, sliding, doubling back along the ancient shoreline. In some places, the same trail of footprints appeared twice, as if someone had walked out toward the water and later walked back. And crossing directly over some of those human tracks was the enormous, rounded footprint of a giant ground sloth, a massive Ice Age creature roughly the size of a car. A child had once walked beside that animal, and the soft lakeshore mud had captured both of their footsteps and held them, undisturbed, for thousands of years. When scientists dated the seeds of an ancient marsh grass found sealed in the layers directly above and below those footprints, the results placed them at a staggering age. It was a number so far outside the accepted range that the researchers didn't just double-check it once. They tested it using 3 completely independent methods: the seeds themselves, pollen grains from land plants that draw their carbon from the air rather than from water, and a separate dating technique, that measures how long mineral grains have been buried away from sunlight. 3 unrelated dating methods, and every single one of them landed inside the same ancient window, placing human activity at that site thousands of years earlier than the oldest confirmed Clovis evidence, and, more strikingly, thousands of years before the northern ice sheets had even begun to separate enough to open the inland corridor that the old theory depended on entirely. That last detail is the one that truly breaks the old story beyond repair. According to the traditional Clovis first model, human beings could not have traveled south into the heart of North America until a corridor opened up between 2 massive ice sheets that once fused together across the northern part of the continent. But the footprints at that ancient lakeshore date to a time when that corridor didn't exist yet. The ice sheets were still locked together as one solid wall, which means those children were not walking south through a gap in the ice because there was no gap for them to walk through. They were already there, thousands of miles south of that frozen wall, long before it ever opened. This single, undeniable fact has quietly reshaped the entire scientific understanding of how the first Americans arrived. Instead of imagining a single dramatic march of mammoth hunters through a melting gap in the ice, many researchers now believe the earliest people may have traveled along the Pacific coastline itself, moving by boat or on foot along a shifting shoreline rich with kelp forests, fish, and shellfish, a route sometimes called the Kelp Highway. It's a far less tidy story than the one drawn on old classroom maps, but it is one that actually fits the evidence now sitting in museum drawers and dating logs across the country. It's important to be honest here about where solid evidence ends and speculation begins, because that line matters, and a responsible telling of this story has to respect it. The Oregon coprolites, the Pennsylvania hearths, and the footprints at that ancient lakeshore all rest on well-documented, independently verified, peer-reviewed research. These are not fringe claims. This is where the mainstream scientific consensus now stands. But there are other claims out there, older and far more sensational, involving broken animal bones tens or even hundreds of thousands of years old, that most archaeologists remain deeply skeptical of, because the same kind of damage those researchers pointed to as evidence of human activity can also be produced naturally by heavy sediment pressure or the simple tumbling of a river over time. A truly extraordinary claim needs truly extraordinary evidence, and not every headline-grabbing discovery has cleared that bar. Being honest about that distinction is part of respecting the science, not undermining it. There's also a valuable lesson buried in the history of this field, a reminder that skepticism isn't always the villain of the story. Decades ago, a respected and passionate researcher became convinced he had found stone tools in California that were hundreds of thousands of years old, far older than anything discussed here. He defended that claim for the rest of his career, but most of his peers eventually concluded that the stones were not tools at all, but geofacts, ordinary rocks naturally fractured to resemble something they were never meant to be. He was brilliant and he was sincere, but in that case, the doubters turned out to be right. What makes the Oregon, Pennsylvania, and New Mexico discoveries different is not passion or conviction. It's corroboration. Independent sites, independent research teams, independent dating methods, all converging on the same conclusion from completely different directions. So, where does this leave the story of the first Americans today? The Clovis hunters, once celebrated as the trailblazing pioneers of an empty continent, were not first at all. They were, in truth, relative latecomers, arriving on land that had already known the sound of human footsteps for thousands of years before them. People had already rested in that Oregon rock shelter. Children had already run along that ancient New Mexico lakeshore beside massive Ice Age creatures. The story taught in classrooms for generations was tidy, memorable, and easy to draw on a map with a single confident arrow. It was also incomplete. And the story is still being written. Because if people were already living in North America more than 14,000 years ago, and if some evidence hints that human presence may reach back further still, the next real question is not whether humans arrived before the ice sheets open a path inland. That question already has an answer. The next question is exactly how early humans made that journey, and how much of the true beginning of that story might still be missing entirely, perhaps resting along ancient coastlines that are now submerged far beneath the modern ocean, drowned by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. waiting for someone to find them. So, here's a question worth sitting with. If people were already resting in that Oregon shelter, and children were already running along that New Mexico lakeshore thousands of years before the accepted timeline allowed, what do you think the true beginning of this story actually looks like? Which piece of evidence in this video convinced you the most, and which one do you still want to see more proof for? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to keep following the story as new sites and new evidence continue to surface, consider subscribing, because the ground still has more to tell us.